There's a phone call that no family ever recovers from completely. Not a breakup phone call. Not a job loss phone call. Not even a diagnosis phone call, as devastating as those are. The specific phone call I'm talking about is the one where someone on the other end of the line tells you that your person, your son, your daughter, your mother, your father, the person who was alive and breathing and just going about their life, is gone. And that the people who were supposed to protect them were somehow involved in the moment they stopped being alive. That call comes in different forms. Sometimes it comes from a hospital. Sometimes it comes from another officer reading from a prepared statement. Sometimes it comes from a bystander who saw what happened and cannot believe they are the one having to make this call. And sometimes, in the worst of these cases, it comes after the family has already watched the footage themselves. After they have already seen it. After they have already had to watch, on a screen, what the final minutes of their person's life looked like. Tonight on Behind the Crime, we are covering 3 of the most gut-wrenching, most heartbreaking, and most consequential stories of families left devastated by the actions, and in one case a devastating inaction, of law enforcement. 3 cases, 3 families, 3 groups of people who trusted the system, called for help, or simply expected the person they loved come home, and instead received something that broke them in ways that no settlement check and no court verdict can ever fully repair. The first story is about a 29-year-old man with schizophrenia named Alex Dold, whose mother called 911 specifically asking for help getting her son to a hospital, and whose family would spend 7 years fighting to have his death classified as something other than an accident. The second story is about a 22-year-old woman named Gabby Petito, whose encounter with police on a Utah roadside was captured on body camera, seen by millions, and became one of the most heartbreaking examples of a missed opportunity in modern law enforcement history, and whose parents have been fighting ever since for a system that learned from what happened to their daughter. And the third story is about a 29-year-old man named Tyre Nichols, a FedEx driver, a photographer, a son who called out for his mother in his final moments, who was beaten by 5 police officers less than a block from his front door, and whose family has had to watch that footage more times than any parent should ever have to watch anything. These stories are real. Every family we discuss tonight is real. Every tear that was shed, and there were many, was real. And every single one of these cases carries a question that the families living through them have never stopped asking. How do we make sure this never happens to anyone else? Echo Lake neighborhood near Snohomish, Washington, March 21st, 2017. Kathy Duncan knew her son. She had lived with Alex Dold's schizophrenia for 10 years, since it first appeared when he was 19 years old. She had watched him fight it, manage it, lose ground to it, find it again. She had sat with him through hospitalizations and medication adjustments, and the particular grief of watching a brilliant, warm, deeply curious person be slowly reshaped by an illness that was no one's fault. Alex had been a forward in a highly competitive soccer academy. He taught himself Spanish and Hungarian. He would sit down in a Vietnamese restaurant, and by the time he finished eating, he would have learned several new phrases. He had dreams of traveling and planned to go to college or culinary school. That was Alex Dold. Curious, generous, funny, full of plans. He became sick at around 19 years old. 4 years, treatment really helped. But as he became sicker, he began to lose the ability to understand that he was sick, making it even more challenging to get him to see doctors. By March 2017, Alex was 29 years old. He had been off his medication for about 3 months. And on the afternoon of March 21st, he and his mother got into an argument about money. He received monthly disability payments. She managed them for him, giving him a daily allowance. He yanked a lanyard around her neck and flipped the living room recliner where she sat today. Then he left. His mother was shaken. She wanted help. Not police help, mental health help. She called the county's mental health department first. They told her Alex wasn't violent enough to warrant a mental health professional being sent. She tried everything she could think of to get someone qualified to help her son before it came to calling 911. She called Jen, Alex's sister, who was 11 years older than him and had functioned as something close to a second mother to him for years. 911 wasn't called by my mom for about 5 hours after her and my brother had their argument, Jen later said, because we really wanted to make sure that we were talking to all the necessary people. There's all this red tape, all these loopholes that you can't get through to get your family member help. So, in the end, everybody suggests to call the police. When Alex came back and sat down on the couch to watch television, his mother called 911, and she was specific. She told the dispatcher that her son was calm, that he needed hospital treatment, that this was a mental health situation. 2 Snohomish County Sheriff's deputies arrived. Jen said dispatchers were told Alex needed a calm and quiet intervention at the house. When Alex tried to close the door on the 2 deputies, Jen said they pushed their way inside and started shouting commands. In his mental state, Alex was unable to comply and ran into his mother's bedroom. What ensued was a fight and wrestling match between Alex, described as a gentle giant by those who knew him, that raged through several rooms in the home and then back out onto the front porch. At least 5 deputies used a tase on Alex 7 times. He was choked unconscious at least twice before the deputies found he was unresponsive after they handcuffed him. Jen was on the phone with her mother, listening. They were screaming and yelling at him. Jen said, "And then I can hear on the phone." She said, "Oh God, they are tarzing him while he was lying on the bed." About 12 minutes after they first called for help, Alex became unresponsive. An hour of CPR could not revive him. An hour of CPR. His mother had called asking for help. And 12 minutes later, her son was gone. The fight for truth begins. After handcuffing Alex in the driveway, deputies left him face down, a position the Justice Department and others have long warned carries a suffocation risk. No one started proper resuscitation for at least 10 minutes. The Snohomish County Medical Examiner reviewed the case. His initial conclusion was homicide, the correct classification when one person's actions cause another person's death, regardless of intent. But when the family's attorney later questioned Dr. Stanley Adams, the forensic pathologist who had reached that conclusion, he revealed something that stopped the family cold. After Adams was fired from his position, the county's chief medical examiner had changed his finding, changed it from homicide to accident. Adams said in testimony, "I have a little bit of heartburn with that because he took my correct answer and he changed it to an incorrect answer." When asked why he classified it as homicide, he replied, "Because when one human being does an action or neglects to do an action that caused the death of another, it really doesn't matter about the intent." The family hugged. We just kept saying, "Did he really just say that? Did he really just say homicide?" Jen Dold recalled, the county's own investigation had cleared the deputies of wrongdoing. An independent review found them within policy. The same deputy who had been at the center of a previous death in 2010, a man named Bryson McGee, whose use of force had already cost the county $600,000 in a settlement, had been the primary deputy involved in Alex Dold's death. One of those deputies had been similarly involved in the 2010 death of a man in Gold Bar years earlier that resulted in a $600,000 civil settlement. The same deputy, the same outcome, and the sheriff's office had done nothing in between. The family's lawsuit argued that the county's failure to discipline McGee after the 2010 death was a proximate cause of Alex's death in 2017, that the sheriff's office had known that using tasers on mentally ill people created a risk of cardiac arrest or death, and had not changed their training or their personnel. 7 years. That is how long the Dold family fought. The county offered around $1.5 million to end the case in 2023. Jen Dold wanted the settlement to require a change to homicide. She wanted the official record to say what she had always known. But the county wouldn't budge. "The process beat us down and we were ready for it to be over," she said. After the settlement, Jen Dold said, "The cycle of protecting bad cops and paying off traumatized and grieving families with taxpayer money will continue." And on the day of the settlement, she said one more thing. On Wednesday, Jen Dold figured there would be another family in our shoes in no time. She was right. Jen Dold had said it from the very beginning. Our family is just devastated thinking about how challenging his life was. As he got sicker, he lost friends and couldn't hold a job, and it was probably very lonely for him. To think that his last moments were really scary and painful on top of everything, after everything we tried to do to protect him, it's just, we're heartbroken. Alex Dold's mother called 911 asking for help getting her son to a hospital. He never got there. He was 29 years old. He had wanted to travel. He had plans. He used to go to the dog park with his sister and their mother's dog, Chelsea, a dog he had named after his favorite soccer team. And he was gone 12 minutes after help arrived. The question this case demands we ask, Here is a question that runs underneath every detail of what happened to Alex Dold, and underneath the cases that followed him in Snohomish County, and underneath the hundreds of similar cases that occur every year across this country. What is a family supposed to do when the person they love is in crisis? Because the path that Kathy Duncan took on March 21st, 2017, was a responsible path. She waited. She called mental health services first. She told the dispatcher her son was calm. She asked for a quiet, measured response. None of it mattered. The system she turned to, the only system that was available to her at that moment, responded in a way that killed the person she was trying to help. Alex Dold is described as a gentle giant by those who knew him. He stood 6 feet tall and weighed 220 pounds. 4 years, he was a card dealer at a shoreline casino. He liked to try out new languages and had dreams of traveling. He had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia a decade earlier. He was not a threat that required 5 deputies and 7 taser deployments. He was a sick person who needed to go to a hospital. And somewhere in the gap between what his family needed and what arrived at that door, Alex Dold lost his life. Moab, Utah, August 12, 2021. Now we travel to a very different kind of grief. A grief that is inseparable from a question that has haunted one family since 2021 and that may never be fully answered. Would she still be alive if they had done their jobs? Gabby Petito was 22 years old. She was on the adventure of her young life, a cross-country road trip with her fiancé, Brian Laundrie. They were driving from New York to visit national parks across the American West. She documented the journey on social media. She was one of those people who seemed to glow in photographs, genuinely happy, genuinely alive, genuinely present in the moment. On August 12, 2021, she and Brian were passing through Moab, Utah, the small desert city that serves as a gateway to Arches National Park in Canyonlands. A witness in the heart of downtown Moab made a phone call to 911. The caller reported seeing a man hitting a woman. They gave police the license plate of the van, and officers found it near the entrance to Arches National Park. Officers Eric Pratt and Daniel Robbins pulled the van over. What followed was documented entirely on their body cameras, footage that the world would eventually watch with growing horror once Gabby went missing weeks later. On that footage, Gabby is visibly distressed. She is crying. She has a small cut below her eye. She is scared and emotional in the particular way that domestic violence victims often appear. Not angry, not combative, but fragile, breaking. The way a person looks when they have been holding too many things together for too long. Brian Laundrie, standing on the other side of the van speaking with the other officer, is calm, composed, cooperative. When asked about the fight, Petito said she was to blame because she had hit Laundrie first. That moment, that sentence, "I hit him first," is a sentence that domestic violence experts, advocates, and researchers say is one of the most recognized hallmarks of an abused partner taking responsibility for their abuser's actions. Linda Oberholz, the CEO of the Abused Women and Children Center in Collier County, said, "It's not very unusual at all for officers to arrive on scene. You have one person who's cool and calm. Usually, that's the aggressor. And then you have someone else who is just completely distraught and emotional, and that tends to be the victim. And that was clearly what happened in this case." But the officers did not see it that way. Despite a state law that required officers to arrest or cite either Petito or Laundrie after the stop, Officer Pratt and his trainee partner officially deemed the encounter a mental health break rather than a domestic violence incident. They split the couple up for the night, placing Laundrie in a motel and leaving Gabby alone to sleep in the van. Officers acknowledged in the body camera footage that she had a cut below her eye, and Petito demonstrated how Laundrie had violently grabbed her face earlier. She said, "He gets frustrated with me a lot." But police never marked the injury on their report or photographed the cut. They let Brian Laundrie walk into a motel room. They let Gabby Petito sleep in the van. And they drove away. 38 days later. 38 days. That is a number the city of Moab's attorneys would later use in court to argue that what happened on August 12th had no meaningful connection to what happened later. Roughly 2 weeks after the Moab stop, Brian brutally murdered Gabby. He left her body in the woods of Grand Teton National Forest. He then drove back across the country in her van, used a debit card, and returned to his family home in Florida alone. Gabby's family reported her missing on September 11th. The missing person case became an international story almost immediately. partly because of the social media trail she had left across the road trip, and partly because of the body camera footage from the Moab stop that was released when she disappeared. Millions of people watched that footage. Millions of people saw the same thing that domestic violence experts and advocates see immediately: a woman who needed help, and officers who didn't recognize it. Gabby's body was found on September 19th in a national forest near the Tetons. Brian Laundrie returned to Florida and went missing. His body was later found in a nature reserve near his family home, with a notebook in which he admitted to killing her. And Gabby's parents, Nicole Schmidt and Joseph Petito, were left to bury their 22-year-old daughter while watching body camera footage of the last time any authority figure saw her alive. Her mother said, "I wanted to jump through the screen, rescue her." The fight for accountability. In late 2021, an independent review by another Utah Police Department found that the Moab officers had made several unintentional mistakes, including failing to issue a domestic violence citation and misinterpreting the law. The lawsuit filed by Gabby's family sought $50 million in damages. It alleged that Moab police failed to recognize the serious danger Petito was in, failed to investigate fully and properly, and that the officers were not properly trained to identify Brian as the true primary aggressor. Attorney Brian Stewart said, "The family believes that Gabby would still be alive today if the police officers had had the proper training and had followed the law in how they responded to Gabby's situation." Joseph Petito, Gabby's father, responded to the city's dismissal of the lawsuit as a GoFundMe campaign with barely contained fury. Moab still doesn't get it. This case has never been about money. It has always been about seeking accountability and fighting for change that will save lives. When law enforcement fails to follow the law, fails to protect, and refuses to learn from its mistakes, like the Moab Police Department, it puts us all at risk. In November 2024, a Utah District Court judge dismissed a lawsuit, citing the state's Governmental Immunity Act, a legal doctrine that shields government entities from certain lawsuits. The judge acknowledged the investigation was faulty, but sided with the city on legal immunity grounds. The family appealed. The Utah Supreme Court scheduled oral arguments for March 2026. Gabby's parents are still fighting. They have also turned their grief into purpose. The Gabby Petito Foundation has partnered with the National Domestic Violence Hotline. They successfully lobbied for a Utah law requiring the Lethality Assessment Protocol, a tool designed to identify domestic violence victims at serious risk of being killed, to be mandatory for all officers responding to domestic violence calls. They are pursuing similar laws in other states. A similar protocol is now required under a 2023 law for domestic violence calls across Utah. The Petito family civil claims are not about money, said Attorney Brian Stewart. Damages awards are the only remedy available in our civil justice system, and maybe the only language that motivates an institution like the Moab Police Department to change. Gabby Petito was 22 years old. She had a cut below her eye. She said she hit him first. The officers left her sleeping in a van. 38 days later, she was gone, and her parents are still in court, still fighting, still saying her name. Memphis, Tennessee, January 7th, 2023. Now we come to the case that shook the country in January 2023. The case that generated more raw, visceral, uncontrollable emotion than almost any law enforcement incident in recent memory. The case that broke into living rooms across America on a Friday night in late January and left millions of people sitting in silence afterward, unable to find adequate words. Tyre Nichols was 29 years old. He worked for FedEx. He was a photographer, genuinely talented, with a website for his work and a real eye for capturing beautiful things. He had a 4-year-old son. He had been raised in Sacramento, California, and moved to Memphis in February 2020. His mother is Rovaughn Wells. According to his family's attorney, he was almost impossibly slim due to Crohn's disease, weighing 145 pounds at a height of 6 feet 3 inches. On the evening of January 7th, 2023, Tyre Nichols was driving through his East Memphis neighborhood. He was stopped by officers from the Memphis Police Department Scorpion Unit, a specialized squad focused on violent crime reduction. Officers later said he had driven into oncoming traffic. But the same officer who made that claim also noted that Nichols had stopped at a red light and put his turn signal on. The police chief later said the department couldn't substantiate any reason for the stop. Tyre Nichols told the officers he was on his way home. He was, in fact, less than a block from his front door. He could have walked to it. He ran after being pepper sprayed and threatened with a stun gun. He fled on foot toward his home. And what happened when they caught him, captured from multiple angles by body cameras and a police poll camera, was released to the public on January 27, 2023. And it changed everything. What the cameras showed. The footage showed Tyre Nichols on the ground, officers around him, kicking, punching, striking him with a baton. Nichols went into cardiac arrest at the scene. He died at a hospital 3 days later, on January 10, 2023. An autopsy attributed his death to blunt force trauma to the head. And in the moments captured on that poll camera, the moments that would be watched by millions of people, that will be described in news articles and court filings and congressional testimony, Tyre Nichols called out for his mother multiple times while he was on the ground, while officers stood around him. His mother, Rovon Wells, later said at a press conference, her voice breaking completely, "For a mother to know their child was calling them in need and I wasn't there for him. Do you know how I feel right now because I wasn't there for my son?" He was calling for her. He was a block from his front door, calling for his mother. And she wasn't there, because she didn't know, because no one had called her, because the officers who surrounded her son, as he called her name, were not running to get her. They were the reason he was calling. U.S. Representative Steve Cohen, who represents part of Memphis, said after watching the footage, "It's clear that Tyre Nichols died because of the brutality and callous disregard, really an appalling lack of humanity, of the Memphis police officers. They were not there to serve and protect, or even to apprehend. They were there to punish and dominate." Footage of the beating captured by the police poll camera also showed the officers milling about, talking and laughing as Nichols struggled. Laughing. The firings, the charges, and the family speaks. Memphis Police Chief Serlin C.J. Davis said the officers had violated multiple police department policies, including excessive use of force, duty to intervene, and duty to render aid. All 5 officers were fired. All 5 were charged criminally, with second-degree murder, among other offenses. The Scorpion unit was disbanded, and then began the long, agonizing road of a family trying to find justice in a system that had already taken their son. Wells spoke through tears at the press conference. She knew what the video showed. She had been told what it contained before it was released to the public, and she already knew that her son, in his final moments on a dark Memphis street, had been calling for her. She said, "You know, it's funny, he always said he was going to be famous one day. I didn't know this is what he meant, but we want justice for my son." 3 Memphis Fire Services employees were terminated for their failure to evaluate or assist Tyre Nichols at the scene. 13 officers total were disciplined, relieved of duty, dismissed, or arrested in connection with the incident. The family filed a $550 million lawsuit. 2 of the 5 officers, Desmond Mills Jr. and Emmett Martin, eventually pleaded guilty in federal court and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. The remaining 3, Tadarius Bean, Demetrius Haley, and Justin Smith, went to trial in state court in Hamilton County, Tennessee, in May 2025. The verdict that broke the family again. The state trial lasted 9 days. The jury deliberated for 8.5 hours over 2 days. On May 7, 2025, the jury found all 3 men not guilty on all charges, including the most serious charge of second-degree murder. They hugged each other and their attorneys after the verdict was read. Nichols' family left the courtroom without speaking to the media after the verdict. They spoke briefly with Shelby County District Attorney Steve Mulrow, who said they were devastated and outraged. Mulrow himself stood outside the courthouse and said something that resonated across the country. "What I do know is this: Tyre Nichols is dead and deserves to be alive. And that is a tragedy," he said. "Was I surprised that there wasn't a single guilty verdict on any of the counts or any of the lesser-included offenses, given the overwhelming evidence that we presented? Yes, I was surprised. Do I have an explanation for it? No." The prosecutor himself had no explanation. Rovon Wells, who had watched the trial, who had been called as a witness by the prosecution, who had already watched footage of her son's death more times than any mother should ever have to, spoke publicly for the first time after the verdict. "We have gotten so much injustice from this city that it is ridiculous. My son was murdered by 5 Memphis police officers. He was murdered." After speaking to the crowd that had gathered, she led them on a march around downtown Memphis. She walked down South Main, up Beale Street, past the burnt-out shell of the historic Claiborne Temple, and back to the Lorraine Motel, where Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated more than 50 years before. She led the march herself, this woman who had buried her son, who had watched the footage, who had testified in court, who had just heard "not guilty" read 21 times. She walked at the front. "The city of Memphis took something very precious away from me," she told the protesters after the march. "But the citizens, the activists, you don't even have a clue." Civil rights attorney Ben Crump, representing the family, released a statement that read, "Today's verdicts are a devastating miscarriage of justice. The world watched as Tyre Nichols was beaten to death by those sworn to protect and serve." The 3 acquitted officers still face sentencing on federal charges for which they were previously convicted. The federal case had found them guilty of less serious charges but acquitted of the most serious. They are scheduled to be sentenced in June 2025. The family's $550 million civil lawsuit is set to go to trial in 2026. According to legal filings, a judgment in the family's favor could bankrupt the city of Memphis. Tyre Nichols was 29 years old. He had a 4-year-old son. He was a block from his front door. He called for his mother. He got 21 not guilty verdicts. His mother led a march. What these 3 cases share: 3 cases, 3 families, 3 different states, 3 different kinds of grief. Jen Dold, sitting alone in her car in a parking lot, unable to drive because she was crying too hard after reading the word accident in her brother's autopsy report. Knowing it wasn't an accident, knowing the word that was right had already been changed to the word that was easier. Nicole Schmidt, watching the body camera footage of her daughter's last encounter with authority, crying, frightened, bleeding, and saying she wanted to jump through the screen and rescue her. Rovon Wells, standing at a microphone, telling a city that her son was calling for her in his final moments, and she wasn't there. Not because she didn't love him, because nobody called her, because the people who were with him were not protecting him. What do these 3 families have in common? They all called for help, or trusted that help would arrive, and they all received something they were not prepared for. Kathy Duncan called 911 asking for a quiet, measured mental health intervention. She received a 12-minute fight that killed her son. Gabby Petito was a woman crying on the side of the road with a cut below her eye and a story she couldn't quite tell directly. Officers were there. They separated the couple for the night. They drove away. Tyre Nichols was driving home. He was a block from his front door. He was stopped for a reason that was never substantiated. In all 3 cases, the moment when an institution that has authority over life and death made a decision to escalate, or not to see, or to use force that did not need to be used, that decision cascaded into everything that came after. What the system is supposed to do and what it sometimes does instead. There is a conversation that happens in law enforcement circles about mental health crisis response, about whether a police officer, trained primarily in law enforcement and the management of physical threats, is the right first responder for a person experiencing a psychiatric episode. Alex Dold's case, and the cases before him in Snohomish County, led to a lawsuit that alleged the county had known for years that using tasers on people in mental health crises could be lethal, and had not changed their training, their protocols, or their personnel accordingly. The lawsuit was settled for $1.5 million. The deputy who had already been involved in a previous death was allowed to resign with his law enforcement certification intact. Jen Dold said it plainly. The cycle of protecting bad cops and paying off traumatized and grieving families with taxpayer money will continue. There is a conversation that happens about domestic violence training, about whether officers responding to domestic calls are equipped to recognize the specific behavioral patterns that indicate a victim who is protecting her abuser or a victim who is at escalating risk of being killed. Gabby Petito's parents successfully lobbied for a Utah law requiring lethality assessment protocols to be mandatory across the state. They are fighting for similar laws in other states through the Gabby Petito Foundation. The law that carries her legacy now requires other departments to do what Moab did not do on August 12, 2021. It will not bring Gabby back, but it almost certainly will, bring someone else home. And there's a conversation about specialized units, about what happens when police departments create tactical squads that operate with reduced oversight, that develop cultures of aggression, that take officers who might be fine in routine patrol contexts and put them in an environment that incubates the worst instincts. In March 2023, the Department of Justice announced a separate review concerning use of force, de-escalation strategies, and specialized units in the Memphis Police Department. The Scorpion unit was disbanded entirely after Tyre Nichols died. All of these conversations are necessary. All of them should have happened before Alex Dold's mother called 911, before Gabby Petito was left asleep in a van, before Tyre Nichols called out for his mother on a dark street a block from his front door. But they are happening now, imperfectly, incompletely, but happening, because of the families who refuse to be quiet. The ongoing cost. More than 9,000 families have suffered the loss of a loved one to police-involved deaths from 2015 to 2023. The data shows that police killed at least 1,352 people in 2023 alone. These aren't just numbers. Every single incident involves a life lost, a family shattered, and a community changed forever. Every one of those 9,000 families has a story that looks something like the ones we have covered tonight. A phone call, a piece of footage, a word in an autopsy report, a verdict read in an empty voice. And every one of those families makes the same decision, sooner or later, about what to do with what happened to them. Some retreat into private grief. Some pour their pain into advocacy. Some file lawsuits that take years and cost them things they didn't expect to lose. Some lead marches in cities that took someone precious from them. All of them are carrying something that started on one ordinary day when someone they loved didn't come home. Kathy Duncan, who called 911 asking for help. Nicole Schmidt, who wanted to jump through the screen and rescue her daughter. Ro Vaughn Wells, who wasn't there when her son called for her because nobody called her. They did not ask for any of this. They did not choose any of this. They are carrying it anyway, and they are still talking, still fighting, still saying the names. Final reflection. There is a phrase that gets used in law enforcement training, in policy documents, in legislative testimony, in the mission statements of police departments across this country. Protect and serve. Those words are supposed to represent a commitment, a promise, an orientation toward the communities that give departments their authority and their funding and their trust. And in the vast majority of encounters, in the everyday calls and traffic stops and welfare checks and domestic disputes that officers handle without incident every single day across this country, those words mean what they are supposed to mean. But these three cases, Alex Dold, Gabby Petito, Tyre Nichols, represent the moments when the gap between the words and the reality opened wide enough to swallow someone's entire future. Alex's mother called for protection for her son. She called specifically asking for a calm, quiet approach. What arrived was force that his body couldn't survive. Gabby's encounter with police was documented on body cameras that the whole world eventually watched. The protection that should have been available to her, a citation, an intervention, a protocol designed specifically to identify women at risk of being killed by their partners, was not applied. Tyre Nichols was stopped without substantiated cause, 1 block from his home, and did not make it to his front door. These families are not asking for the impossible. They are not asking for a world without police, or without accountability, or without the difficult and necessary work of keeping communities safe. They are asking for the thing that the words on the door of every police car are supposed to promise. Protect and serve. Do that. Do that for the son with schizophrenia whose mother is asking you to take him to a hospital quietly. Do that for the young woman crying by the roadside with a cut below her eye who says she hit him first. Do that for the 29-year-old photographer who is a block from his front door telling you he is on his way home. Do that. And maybe, the phone call that breaks family forever comes a little less often. Before you go, I need to hear from you on these 3 cases. All 3 of them represent very different failures. Alex Dold's case is about what happens when officers trained for force respond to a mental health crisis. Gabby Petito's case is about what happens when officers don't have the training to recognize the signs of domestic abuse that are right in front of them. And Tyre Nichols' case is about what happens when a culture of aggression inside a specialized unit goes unchecked. Here's what I want you to answer in the comments. Which of these 3 systemic failures do you think is the hardest to fix, and why? End this. Ro Vaughn Wells led a march through downtown Memphis after hearing 21 not guilty verdicts read for the men who beat her son to death. What does that kind of resilience, the ability to keep walking, to keep speaking, when the system has failed you at every level, tell you about what grief can become when it has nowhere else to go? Tell me in the comments, because these names deserve to be spoken. These stories deserve to be heard completely. And these families deserve to know that what happened to them has not disappeared into the silence that institutions prefer. Alex Dold, Gabby Petito, Tyre Nichols. Say their names. And if this episode moved you, share it. Because Kathy Duncan deserved to have her son taken to a hospital when she asked. Because Nicole Schmidt deserved to see her daughter come home from that road trip. Because Rove Vaughan Wells deserved to not be sitting by the phone when her son was a block from her front door calling her name. They all deserve better. This has been Behind the Crime. Subscribe if you haven't already. And we will see you in the next one.